Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to the program today. My name is Emilio Ramos. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Red Grace Media. It's good to be with you. Today on the program, very excited to have a special guest on. We will be joined by Dr. Lane Tipton from the Reformed Forum. And I definitely want to commit as much time as possible to Lane and to the theology that we want to discuss today. I just want to remind the viewers, if you are joining us, this is not our regular time slot. We were actually on at 7 o'clock, a couple hours later, but this time worked better for Lane, and so I thought this would be a little bit of an early broadcast, and that's okay. So if you're joining us, welcome. Be sure to subscribe and share and join the conversation today if you'd like. Also, just be aware that we have begun a new series on Red Grace Media entitled 7 Minute Seminary, which is actually an old segment of an old podcast we used to do, and now we're doing that through video. So be sure and take advantage of those 7-minute seminaries and everything else that we're really producing here at Red Grace Media. We hope that you will benefit from that, take advantage of that. And again, I want to devote as much time to our guest today as possible. And so before Lane joins us, I just want to introduce Lane Tipton. For those of you that do not know Lane Tipton he's currently a fellow of systematic and biblical theology at the Reformed Forum, which is a website that if you do not know, if you're not familiar with, that's a website that you definitely want to get familiar with. And it's a website that I have benefited from for so many years. Cannon Busey and the rest of the guys at the Reformed Forum, they've been nothing but a blessing to me. But as it regards to Brother Lane, Lane Tipton at one point served as pastor of Trinity Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Easton, Pennsylvania. Lane also still does good. And also Lane earned his MDiv from Westminster Seminary in California, and also from Westminster he earned his PhD, did a dissertation on Cornelius Van Til's Trinitarian theology, which sounds, therefore, like we're going to have him back for another episode to talk about something else. And also, really important here, and really I'm glad that you guys disclosed this at the Reformed Forum on your book, No Uncertain Sound. The theological interests that are listed here are very important, even for the conversation that we're going to have, for the conversation that we're going to have today with Lane Tipton, which is the fact that his theological interests include hermeneutics, soteriology, Christology, covenant theology, Trinitarian theology, modern theology, and this is maybe the most important for our segment, the integration of biblical theology and systematic theology. That is the reason that I have decided to have Dr. Tipton on the program, is to kind of just talk us through and walk us through a little bit of that integration, but really focusing in on biblical theology. And so with that, Dr. Tipton, welcome to the program. It's good to see you.
Hey, Emilio, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, you and I, we were supposed to be fellowshipping right about now in Southern California, or at least a couple days ago, but we were just interrupted by just a little bit of a situation that erupted out of nowhere. How are you doing, brother, with I guess the obvious, something that's on everybody's mind, so we should at least point it out, the coronavirus? You're doing well. You said your family's doing well.
Yeah, doing well. Thinking in terms of 2 Corinthians 4:17, it, along with the suffering of the rest of this age, is a momentary light affliction, an affliction to be sure, but momentary in light compared to the glory to be revealed at Christ's return and our elevation into heaven to be with him forever. So, we're doing well, and we'll continue to be in prayer as a church for many, many people who are exposed to great danger with this virus. So we'll be continuing to look to the Lord in prayer.
Good. Wonderful, brother. Well, just to give everybody a little bit of a background on why I've asked Dr. Tipton to come and join us today, and where does our connection come from? Well, Many years ago now, I was at a conference, the Gospel Coalition Conference, with a good friend of mine, Joseph Urban, and we saw that Camden Busey was at the Westminster booth. And so we said, hey, there's the Reformed Forum guy. Let's go talk to him. And you were joining him that day. So you guys were just fellowshipping, hanging out. And that was our first time we met. And Joseph and I had all kinds of questions for you about covenant theology and whatnot. And, Lane, I mean, not to sort of flatter you here, but I talked to a lot of guys, a lot of big speakers, a lot of big names out there, let's say. And I want to thank you, brother, because that day you probably don't even remember, but you took so much time with us to explain covenant theology, to explain biblical theology. I mean, you took a good chunk of your time to spend with us, and brother, I really, really appreciated that. That left an indelible mark for us, and I probably not something you remember, but we appreciated you in that moment.
I recall it. If you want to know the truth, brother, I actually do.
Yeah. It was a good.
It was a delight. Yeah. Let me put it this way in response. It was a delight then, and it is a delight to reflect on now. Yeah. That was a very good time.
Amen.
I do.
Well, it was a good time, but not as good of a time as Wimberley, Texas. I was part of the Wimberley conference, and I still tell people to this day that there was, I don't know, maybe 40, 45, maybe 50 people there. I don't recall, but
somewhere there.
I still tell people that's the best conference that I've ever attended. And it was a total blessing because it gets to the very heart of the stuff that I want to talk about today and the things that I love to study and the things that I sort of try to awaken people to with respect to biblical theology. Lane, that last part of your bio, the integration between biblical and systematic theology is everything that anyone, especially at my church, that knows from Sunday schools or everything else that I do, is what I'm trying to awaken people to, especially with regard to biblical theology. There's a huge education curve that comes with, even today, what we're going to talk about, Vos, Meredith Kline, biblical theology, covenant theology, and so this is right up my alley, and this is kind of where I cut my teeth nowadays. And so, just so you understand, I sort of got my biblical theology from Edmund Clowney, his Unfolding Mystery. Many years ago now, but that introduced me to other guys, Goldsworthy, G.K. Beale, Ritterboss, all these different guys, and then now ultimately what we want to talk about today in terms of Vos and Kline. And recently you did a couple lectures at a Reform Forum conference where the History of Heaven lectures, which were phenomenal. I've watched them repeatedly, and that was you trying to kind of bring Vos and Kline together somewhat. So let's begin there, brother, just talking a little bit specifically about biblical theology, specifically talking about Vos, their contribution, their differences, and how they complement each other. How would you begin to conceive of that relationship between Vos and Kline?
Well, let's put it this way. There's a clear paternal relation, if I could put it that way. Vos is the father, and Kline would be the son, obviously, as in a manner similar to the way Vos would relate to Gaffin. But anyway, the point is that I think what you find in Vos is you find something unparalleled in the development of Reformed theology. You find someone who, as we know, not only wrote a dogmatics, which we could talk about on its own terms, but we're not going to tonight, but he also wrote and developed the biblical theology. And the reason why that's so important is that the biblical theology is, and then there's no end of directions we could go with this, but that the biblical theology is an attempt by Vos to say, if we're going to think about the topics of systematic theology properly, God's relation to man, for instance, how does God, the doctrine of God, relate to man, the doctrine of man? How do you relate that? Vos, in the development of biblical theology, says, well, instead of thinking about the two in abstraction, topically, you need to think about the two in relation historically. That's the key. In other words, what biblical theology is going to orient its study toward is the, if we could put it this way, is the history of special revelation. And that history of special revelation provides a principle of organization that is historical in character, and therefore you can relate God to man in a way that is organic and progressive and historical, very sensitive to those features, as opposed to simply saying, I'm going to do my doctrine of God, do existence, attributes, Trinity, etc. Then I'm going to do man, image of God, covenant, and I'm going to leave them as separate topics. I've done all my work on the doctrine of God over here in this compartment. I've done all my work on the doctrine of man here on this, and put it in this compartment. And the danger of systematic theology is that you can start compartmentalizing your theology. And so what biblical theology does to supplement a very good method of systematic theology is it begins by looking at the historical concern of revelation and taking the history of special revelation as the organizing principle. And when it does that, Emilio, when Vos, it really does open up. I haven't gotten to Kline yet.
Yep.
But it really does open up now what we could call a biblical theological program. And what that program is, if I could say it most broadly, and this is so important, is Vos looks at the liberal biblical theological project announced by Gabler, late 1700s, 87, 88, 89. The distinction between biblical and systematic theology. The liberal tradition had made the history behind the Bible, the history of religious experience behind the Bible, to be the fundamental concern of the script. And what Vos did in his biblical theology, he said, listen, the history that the scriptures present to us, that's a history of concrete, objective, mighty deeds of God in the creation of the heavens and the earth, the invisible and the visible. God has created them all. And biblical theology is going to be looking at the God-world relation from that historical line of development, and not from the topical per se. I mean, the topical will be invoked, but the topical will have a kind of servant relation to the biblical theological, and vice versa. The historical principle of organization is going to predominate. And Emilio, that is what I think we can really come to appreciate about Vos as a kind of a pioneering figure in the history of Reformed theology. So, amen. He really almost deserves his own. I mean, we're not doing it here. We're doing things looking at Kline, but just contemplating the significance of his biblical theology is an endeavor well worth its own time. Absolutely.
And I think, would it be fair to say that what you're getting in Vos's biblical theology is specifically focused on the doctrine of revelation and the way that revelation that's sort of the central component that ties in all of the things that you're talking about that we tend to sort of splinter. It is this history. It is special revelation and the way it organically unfolds that tends to tie everything in for Vos.
It does, and let me put it this way in terms of what's ultimate and integrative for Vos. When you say it's a history of revelation, you hit the nerve center, Emilio. That's the precise thing you should focus on. And it's a revelation of what? Here's the key. A revelation of the immutable perichoretic glory of the triune God, who as such acts in creation, acts in redemption, acts to raise Christ from the dead, acts to consummate the world at the end of this age, so that what the fundamental content of that history of special revelation is, quite simply, is the glory of God. And so what's the practical effect of that? People say about Vos, well, that sounds really kind of pie in the sky, a history of special revelation about the glory of God. Well, here's the point, to just try to say it all up front, and then we can develop it. Why is God revealing his glory? I'm going to tell you there's only one reason, Vos would say, from the side of the creature, one fundamental reason, and it is so that he might be worshipped, served, honored, and enjoyed. Right? So that the history of special revelation, you see, is a history of the progressive unfolding of the unchanging glory of God in his relation to creation. And so what has he done? Well, that instantly takes away biblical theology from the liberal tradition, because the liberal tradition simply says, well, it was a history of religious experience. And Vos says, no, it's a history of revelation. It's not a history of anthropology. It's a history of the mighty deeds of God. And that God who reveals himself, Malachi 3:6, the God of the covenant, is an unchanging God in his glory. So anyway, the bottom line is, Vos, he's turning us to a historical consideration of the Scriptures. And the Scriptures are a history of special revelation. And that revelation has its fundamental concern in the glory of God and the corresponding worship that should attend his glory. That's one way to try to get at the central programmatic concern.
Sure. I would say, in a sense, not to get ahead of ourselves here, but in a sense, that makes sense when you think about the cultus of Israel, even, that is really the central concern. Is, if I can just put it in layman's terms, it's constructing a house of worship and filling it with worshipers.
Yes.
Right?
Well, let me put it flip side. It's God commanding a house of worship to be filled with his glory.
There you go. Yeah.
And then for a people to enter and worship that glory through a high priest. But yes, in your layman's illustration, it's a beautiful one. Construct a house, the people come in, and what's the central concern when they're in there? Glory of God.
Wow.
Worshiping his glory.
And
hey, that's perfect, Emilio.
Yeah, and that's why biblical theology to me has been such a burden as a pastor, to try to get members in our church to awaken to the grandeur, really the grandeur of what we're looking at when we're reading a Vos, a Kline, and these kinds of things. Is what they're trying to illustrate is the most magnificent vision of the glory of the triune God. And we do our people a great disservice when we are not laboring to try to open up fresh vistas, perspectives of how that glory can be seen and understood by the Christian in this world and in this life. So
that's exactly right. And to put just one thought out in response to that, which is so useful, is that I think it's often the case that people miss that biblical theology, all theology actually, but biblical theology reminds us really directly that the end to which we are created is the worship of God in heaven. And the glory of God is the predominant and ultimately exhaustive concern. And that's the sort of thing I really do think Vos is especially useful in. Danny Olinger, I don't remember if you've ever had him on, but
No.
he did a little piece on Vos a while back, and he reminds that, it's really in the cultus of Israel or in any other situation in the post-fall scenario in covenant relation with God. It's the glory of the Lord, which is the joy and strength of his people. And that's what you're at. That's what you're saying, Emilio. And it's a beautiful that thought, I think, tries to capture incisively what Vos and Kline are after, because Psalm 27:4, you want to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord in his temple, and that gaze is a worshipful or worshiping gaze. Anyway, yes.
No, amen. I actually was reading Danny Ollinger's book today in preparation for this conversation.
It's excellent.
It's an excellent book, really, really good book, and we'll put it for people watching, even people watching the on the uploaded version of this. Look at the comments or the description below. We'll try to link to Danny's book, because it's a really, really good book on Vos. And so, okay, well, we can spend all of our time just talking about and introducing Vossian concepts. But to be honest, and one of the reasons why I really appreciate you guys and the Reformed Forum and what y'all are doing is because you also integrate Kleinian thought. I don't know if that's a word, but
sure. I know what you mean.
but Kleinian,
his own distinctive contribution.
Oh, indeed, and not an easy contribution to try to introduce to people. If you think Vos is hard to introduce to people, I think Kline's harder. I think Kline's kind of got a deeper initiation curve, if you would. But so talk to us about the significance, the importance of Kline, and how does Kline then, if you would, pick up the torch from Vos and move the conversation forward, I guess I would say. But how would you describe Kline's impact on all this?
Well, let me tell you, this is so interesting, the timing of this. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but I just wrote a very brief review for New Horizons of Kline's collected writings, and I'd already read them all numbers of times before, but they're compiled in this format. It's a beautiful thing. And what I'll say a thought or two here. Kline is without a doubt an heir of Vos. He sees the scriptures as the God-breathed word, and he's committed to the same biblical theological method that he learned by reading Vos and understanding Vos. But I'll tell you this. I'll tell you one of the contributions of Kline, if I could put it this way. Now, let me see if I can frame it this way. What predominates in Vos's biblical theology, and this is quite clear, he makes this explicit in a number of places, is the centrality of heaven as the realm for the worship and inheritance that is God himself. So when Vos is reading Westminster Confession 7:1, he's saying, look, the natural religious fellowship that Adam had on earth cannot have its full fruition while on earth. You have to have a covenant so that distance, that religious distance, might be closed. And Adam might have that natural religious fellowship consummated through covenantal obedience. Well, what Vos is assuming there is that there's a distinction between heaven and earth, and that there's a certain way that the earth is going to relate to heaven in the future, in the consummation. But there's a certain relation at the time point of creation between heaven and earth. And that relation is simply this, and this is where Kline really starts to pick up, and it's where he shows himself to be quite self-consciously the heir of Vos. Vos prioritizes heaven in relation to earth. Kline begins his theology by making a very basic distinction in Genesis 1:1 and then Genesis 1:2 through 31. And that distinction is the distinction between the upper register of heaven, the invisible heavenly realm. That was created in the absolute beginning, Genesis 1:1. So Genesis 1:1 is the creation of the invisible heaven temple. It's a distinct dimension of created holy space, and it's filled with the indoxate spirit and angels worshiping the glory of God. Now, so that's Kline's starting point.
Yeah.
So he starts, and he calls it indoxation. The glory spirit fills the heaven temple with the perichoretic glory of the Trinitarian persons, as the Spirit is indoxate in that realm in a unique and mysterious relation, where he doesn't change, but the temple changes. It's filled with glory. It's filled with angels. You know.
And Lane, if I can just kind of ask a question here.
Sure.
Well, because you mentioned perichoresis and the perichoretic, a lot of people don't understand what we mean by that.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. that's why this is.
I'm going to modify the level. I'm sorry, brother. I forgot that.
No, I don't want you to. I want you to keep it as deep as long as you're willing to clarify any questions that I might think would be maybe just helpful for people that may not know what perichoresis is all about. But you're obviously talking about the Spirit and his capacity in when he fills the heavenly temple to display the triune glory of God or something like that, right?
Yeah. Let me put it in the most simple terms of all. I'll use an analogy, an anthropomorphism that might be useful. When the Spirit enters that temple, it's the Spirit of the Father and the Son.
Right.
And so the triune personal God creates and then fills that space with his personal presence to be worshipped and adored. And what is his personal presence? It's the personal presence of the unchanging glory of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen. That's great. That's so helpful for people.
Yeah.
And it's good because we have to account for that in our Trinitarian theology, or else we can make some mistakes. If we don't have perichoresis in the right position and at the right time, we can kind of come up with all sorts of anti-Trinitarian conclusions. Yeah,
I can put in a fairly simple traditional way that each person subsists distinctly as the entire essence of God. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit is God.
Amen.
But yet, while each person distinctly subsists as the essence of God, each person exhaustively indwells the other person while retaining his full and distinct personal identity. It's a relation of coherence. It is ineffably sublime, but I want to tell you, that is the beatitude of God. Those subsistent and coherent relations of reciprocal and mutual glory, and it's that glory that heaven gives a direct venue to worship. That's the beatific vision. So Genesis 1:1 for Kline is heaven. And then you could think of it this way. As in the absolute beginning, the heaven temple is formed instantly. And no sooner is that heaven temple formed or created instantly than the Spirit in Genesis 1, that heaven temple hovers down over the tohu vavohu, the formless void, and begins to form and fill the world in the space of 6 days. And so you have this avian form of descent, and that avian form of descent is going to consist in bringing into being, forming, and filling the entire lower register of creation. So Genesis 1:2 through 31 is the creation not of the space and time in heaven, which is created first, but it's the creation of the space and time in the visible cosmos. A text, if anyone wants a proof text, you say, where in the world do you get that? Well, Genesis 1:1, we can't read all these, but Genesis 1:1 and Colossians 1:16 are companion texts. Paul is interpreting Christologically Genesis 1:1 and Colossians 1:16, and there he says that the Son made all things in heaven and on earth. And then what are the things in heaven? Invisible. Mm-hmm. What are the things on earth? Visible. So the point, the Kline's point, that, and I think this is as Vossian as it gets, is that in the historical order of creation, heaven precedes the creation of the earth. Right? So because it's instantaneously created, filled with the divine glory of the Spirit. Kline calls that indoxation, and the angels are worshiping in heaven. But then Genesis 1:2, the Spirit who, as it were, breathes out the heavenly temple, fills it with angels and the glory of God, then descends and fills the earth and forms and fills the earth and orders it. That's a very distinct. In fact, if you were to ask me, where do you go to get the most foundational distinction in Kline's biblical theology? Right there. And then the only other thing I would add, and this is something I've been working on in the form of a little book, is that after the creation week, those Trinitarian persons who in the Spirit dwell and doxate to be worshipped in heaven, those persons at the end of the creation week rest from their work of creation. Mm-hmm. And remember, of course, Isaiah 40:23 through 28, God doesn't rest because he's tired. Mm-hmm. It's not a fatigue. It's a royal enthronement for worship, right? Mm-hmm. So they rest for what purpose? That the triune God, the Trinitarian persons, as one God, I've got to be very careful here, the Trinitarian persons who are one God rest from the work of creation. And that resting is now not indoxation of Genesis 1:1, it's Sabbath rest of Genesis 2:2. Those two poles, those two movements in heaven, indoxation Genesis 1:1, Sabbath rest Genesis 2:2, that is the history of heaven that Kline charts and develops in certain features of Kingdom Prologue, in certain portions of Images of the Spirit, and especially in what I consider to be still, I can't believe I'm saying this, his last seems to be his most breathtaking work to me, although there are good ones beside, God, Heaven, and Armageddon. Yes. So really the heaven-centered worship of God from Vos is writ large across the, let me put it this way, across the upper register in Kline's theology.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I was, in listening to you, what stood out to me as we transition into taking all of that, but transitioning to another subject, namely the history of heaven, is your reference to the Sabbath. And the idea that, and what really impacted me as I was reading Kingdom Prologue early on, is how important protology is to your entire understanding of the entirety of the Bible, and understanding that when you look at the prologue, you have an entire eschatological schema, if I can use that language, set before you right there in the prologue. You have an entire programmatic sort of outline for what, correct me if I'm wrong, but what we can make out of the present age, what it is, where it's going, and what the telos is, the goal of it all. So can you, as you transition now, because I want you to talk about your lectures on the history of heaven. The history of heaven is a phrase that comes from Meredith Kline. You know, I'm doing a Kline group at our church, and I've been teaching that. So I know page 12, History of Heaven. I'm quite familiar with it, and it's kind of a mind-blowing concept when people first understand it. It really is. Heaven has a history, but what about that? Lane, what about that? How do we understand the history of heaven? What is it? What does the Sabbath tell us about it, etc.?
Yeah, let me put it this way: the history of heaven, if you think of it from a Vossian and Kleinian standpoint, what must it be about? I know that's a rhetorical question. I've got to stop asking those. I'm not teaching in the classroom anymore. I've got to adjust this. But what is it that the history of heaven serves? What point is the history of heaven about? Why is it important if someone were to ask that? Here's the answer. It's very simple. The unchanging glory of the triune God. See, the history of heaven serves that unchanging glory. How? Well, there's this. Let me frame it in this way. And for your listeners, I'm going to try to pitch this right about the educated adult Sunday school level, Emilio. Is that about right?
Brother, I would say you can go as deep as you want here, because I want this to be a resource that we come back to time and time again. And so I'm not concerned so much about.
I won't go technical. I won't.
So you can go as deep as you want, brother. You're welcome. You're entitled to that.
The beauty of it is there's a simplicity to it.
Right.
No pun is intended on that. But let me just put it this way. Remember this now. Geerhardus Vos in the Reformed Dogmatics, Book 2, Volume 2, Volume 1, pages 171, 179. He makes this point about the relation of God to creation. And it's called, I call it, the logic of the new relation. Vos calls it the new relation of creation. Now, in the when God creates, he does so immediately. He doesn't create from anything. He creates immediately. And if you were, that creation does not require anything but God in order to exist, to be created. Okay, but he creates it. And in that relation of creation, which is a work of God, it's a work of God. God himself does not change, but the relation to creation changes, and the creation in relation to God changes. But God doesn't change. And so the standard, uniform way that the Reformed have always spoken about the new relation to creation is that the immutable, living, and personal triune God sovereignly wills a new relation to creation without himself changing in that new relation.
Amen.
Now, once you understand that, once that concept gets clear, I call that the deeper Protestant conception of the new relation to creation.
Lane, quickly, if you can qualify that the deeper Protestant conception over against what?
Yes, it would be more precisely also the Reformed principle, or the Reformed Presbyterian covenantal view. The confessional view. The deeper Protestant conception would be that. It's like the deeper Protestant conception is the Reformed confessional view in its religious expression.
Is that to be against Catholicism, rather? I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. You beat me to it. So that the relation between God and the creature is a relationship between an unchanging God and a changing creature. In the case of Roman Catholicism, there is a lot that we can say, but the most basic thing is that in the relation between God and the creature participates in the essence of God and enters into the interiority of the perichoresis itself.
Yes.
Now, that right there, that penetration into the interiority of the of the divine processions, that's not that's violating in the creator-creature relation what you've affirmed in the creator-creature distinction, namely that God is eternal, infinite, and unchangeable, and the creature is temporal and finite and changeable. And the creature never ceases to be a creature if advanced in fellowship with God. But for the Reformed, but for the Roman Catholic, the creature can transcend its own essence and participate in the essence of God. And that doctrine of participation and the theology of nature and grace that connects man to God, that's a huge, huge problem for Rome. On the other side, and I don't want to go too deep on this, but on the other side, this view is also to be set over against all modernist conceptions of the creator-creature relation. In all forms of modernism, from Schleiermacher forward, God must be composite. He must take on qualities, attributes, or properties he doesn't have in himself in order to relate to the creature. So if it's Schleiermacher or Barth, what does God do? If it's Schleiermacher, he wills himself into the ideal humanity of Jesus in something akin to a Hegelian event of evolution where the divine evolves into the ideal human. Or if it's Barth, God instantly and from all eternity, eternally actualizes his own person in Jesus Christ in a reciprocal relation to the creature by doing what? By taking a third time and relating himself to the creature in that third time. Whatever that third time is what the deeper Protestant conception says no to.
Now,
so for Barth,
and would you say that because of the aseity of God, you cannot have any such you can't have God in any way changing or taking on things he didn't have before, or you can't have God entering into some sort of third time like you're mentioning, because that would do violence both to the immutability and to the aseity of God.
Yeah, I was on an interview a few days ago with James Dolezal and Camden at Reform Forum, and James put it this way. He said that simplicity and immutability simplicity has a sentinel function with regard to the other attributes of immutability, omniscience, and omnipresence. And what he was getting at there, I believe, is that God does not take things new to himself when he relates to the creature, because God relates to the creature. All that God is, God himself, and not another, relates to the creature. And so any move that would like Barth, that would, or Hegel is this way, the process theist, Hartshorn is this way, the open theists are this way. In all the Socinians went in this direction. God, in order to relate to creation, must, in the event of relating, enter into the interiority of the finitude and change of creation, and in that way change. And so on that view, what you wind up with is a form of modalism. The true God is never known. What is known is whatever he becomes in order to relate to the creature. Right. But if you maintain that he's immutable behind that revelation, he could never be known. So for Barth, there's skepticism at the end of the day.
Okay, and so bringing this doctrine of God, therefore, the deeper Protestant conception, as, in a sense, that is really the whole telos of everything, is God conferring himself as he is upon us and upon his creation. And so, therefore, how is that achieved in the history of heaven?
Well, this is, I don't want to preview too much of what I have done with it, but I want to try to give you what I think Yeah, I guess I will, because a history of heaven is what I'm writing on. So I'll tell you what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Let me put it this way. How's the history? Let me give you one example. If you ask the question, how's the history of heaven helpful for understanding covenant theology? Here's one way, and tell me if you like this. If in the Westminster Confession 7:1, Emilio, do you mind if I read it?
Oh yeah, please.
Okay, I don't have one up, but I'm going to just pull it up on my computer right now. And I should have one but I've just had to move my books into my study. I moved lately.
Okay.
And yeah.
No,
and
go ahead. Go right on ahead.
Okay, hold on one second. Okay. All right, Emilio. Let's see here. Westminster Confession. It has taken me just a moment, and now we are finally there. Sorry for that long delay.
That's okay.
Westminster Confession 7:1. Now listen to this. The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him as their creator, yet they could never have any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward, but by some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he has been pleased to express by way of covenant. Now here's the question. Two questions. First, what is the distance between God and the creature? That's question one. And secondly, what is voluntary condescension? Kline is extremely helpful here, and the work I'm doing on the history of heaven is going to try to shed light on this. May I give it a shot, Emilio?
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
One way to take, it's not a standard way to take, distance, is the ontological distance of the creator-creature distinction, right? God is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. His being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, knowledge, love, goodness, and truth. I added love there. And then the creature is at every point dependent on God for being and knowledge. There is no univocal point of being or knowledge between God and man, because God's knowledge and being are coincident, and God is simple and man is not. So the creator-creature distinction is in place. Some people say that's the distance in view. Well, that's actually not the distance. Look at the text more carefully. The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures owe obedience to him as creator, pause. Now, what is that clause saying? Look, the distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures owe obedience to him as their creator, this isn't contemplating the creator-creature distinction and the ontological distance. It's contemplating the creator-creature relation and the religious distance between Adam and God. Why do we say that? Well, you're asking me the question, how does the history of heaven help this? Well, as long as Adam is on earth, Emilio, and as the image of God, created in natural religious fellowship with God, created in original righteousness, pays Roman Catholicism, what does he do? He worships God naturally according to his word. His natural propension is only to worship God in original righteousness. But as long as he's doing that, he is only doing what he is obligated to do naturally as an image bearer. So what is an image bearer to do? He is to glorify God with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength. He is to obey him perfectly, and he owes God everything by nature, and God owes him nothing. You absolutely have to be able to appreciate that. God owes, by nature, Adam owes God everything. God owes Adam nothing. And where is God? Here's where the history of heaven helps. Genesis 1:1 or Jeremiah 17:12, or Psalm 11:4, or Isaiah 6:1-4. God's throne is in heaven and Adam is on earth. As long as that's the case, here's the key term: Adam's worship of God is indirect. There's an earthly veil that keeps Adam from gazing up into the heaven temple. He can only see the visible sky. He can't see the invisible heaven temple yet. So as long as he's on earth, there's a religious distance, a distance in his worship. We call it a worship distance. I don't know. Religious distance might not be the best term. I'm just trying to communicate a concept.
I was going to say, if we're thinking about Kline, this is why it's important to understand what he means by the earthly projection of the supernal, of the heavenly, of the upper register. That what Adam has in front of him is I don't want to just. It's not pure symbolism, because Kline rejects that, but it's an earthly projection of a higher life.
Yes, and it's the earthly projection of indoxation. Is precisely what it, I mean. If you get real precise, it is the angels worship God's glory in heaven. Adam is to worship God's glory on earth. The angels have direct access to God's glory as angels. Adam has indirect glory, access to God's glory as a man on earth. When Adam obeys, here's what happens: the Eden and the lower register. There's a translational event. And this is what this is the concept I'm trying to develop in the book. If Adam had obeyed, the lower register would be translated into the upper register and what I call heavenized. But here's the problem with that. On the earth, only Eden is the theocracy. Only Eden is a microcosmic holy realm that's technically the copy of heaven, right? Now, and I'm going to try to make Wimberly, I'm going to try to help it make sense. In Eden, then, not only is whole earth a copy, visible heaven and earth a copy of the expansive glory of heaven, but Eden is a microcosmic representation of the holy space in heaven. So, if Eden is that microcosmic replica, and the distance between Adam and God is so great that if he keeps worshiping on earth without covenant, as created, if he were to worship without covenant, he would have no hope. So what happens? Genesis 2:7, he's created in the image of God, and that's a work of creation. Okay, so the work of creation occurs. Now, immediately upon the point of the work of creation in Genesis 2:7, God creates Adam, and there's a concurrent but distinct act of special providence that takes Adam, Genesis 2:8, and enters into covenant with him in the Garden of Eden. And in Westminster Confession 7:1, that covenant is that distinct but concurrent providential event. Westminster Shorter Catechism, the covenant of works is not a work of creation narrowly, it's an act of special providence. And the voluntary condescension on God's part gives Adam and his environment in Eden the opportunity to enter into Sabbath rest. So here's the question: how is Sabbath rest going to be? How will Adam enter into Sabbath rest? Well, now the book's going to say this a lot more rigorously and carefully, but Adam and Eden and the lower register are created with the potential to consummate in heaven. And so if Adam had obeyed, the Spirit would reproportion Adam and Eden into full conformity to the holy space of heaven in a dimensional translation. There would be so at the time point of absolute consummation, the lower register with its holy and very good distinction would be translated and dimensionally reproportioned perfectly to the fullness of heaven by the Spirit. And in that way, Adam and the earth will be forever transformed and conformed to heaven. So it's a full-orbed transforming and conforming of the lower register to heaven, making the whole of that lower register, when heavenized, making that into an arena that yields direct access to God in the glory temple in heaven.
Amen. And you tie that together, and I've often thought this, and I think I've even taught this a couple times, where we could say, based on everything you just said right now, because you brought in the element of the Spirit, okay? And so what we can say is that protology is eschatology, and that eschatology is fundamentally pneumatology, because it's by, through, and in the Spirit that this consummate state is going to be reached. And I'm learning from, you tell me if you agree with that. Yeah, but I'm learning from Kline that fundamentally he is a pneumatologist.
Yes, he like Calvin. See, the thing that relates, I think, Calvin, Vos, and Kline is that they are all theologians of the Spirit. They are all theologians of the Spirit. And hey, listen, I'll give you a concrete example of that reproportioning idea. I use this at Wimberley, so I'm putting it into the book. And I'm in fact, I was working on it right when you and I got online. I was writing right up until that moment, and I'm going to go back to writing, I think, when we finish here. But
okay, well, if I give you any insights, you make sure to at least cite me in the footnote or something.
Oh, brother, if you would ever care to be cited in the book I've read,
right.
please, I will do it, brother. No, absolutely.
I can't wait to get my hands on that, brother. Whatever it is you're writing.
Well, think of it this way: if you think of Eden properly, and you let its topography dimensionally get embedded in your mind, Eden in Ezekiel 28:13 and 14. In 28:14, it's a mountain. In 28:13, it's the garden of God. So Eden, then this is what I was driving at in Wimberley. And Emilio, I tried in Wimberley. I did my very best to just scratch the surface. That's all I did there. And so the book is a lot more programmatic. It needs to be. That Wimberley was just meant to scratch the surface. This is a lot more programmatic.
Oh, yeah, you only had 28-minute sessions or something like that. So I mean, I
tried. I did my best.
But it was wonderful because everyone that was there, at least I can speak for myself, we all had a beautiful 10,000-foot view of everything, and it wasn't hard to connect the dots of what you were trying to say, but it was definitely profitable. So don't.
Well, praise the Lord. Yeah. Praise the Lord. I just anyway, the Eden has the structure of a mountain garden, so that garden is kind of the central concentrated focal place of worship. That holy space, in it, if you get down to the very core of it, it's that holy space that is then reproportioned to the whole of heaven. That's going to be my particular specific point. And so the whole lower register is transformed to be holy space as it is permanently heavenized. What does heavenizing mean? It means dimensionally, a more technical way to put it, you could say that it is dimensionally reproportioned to the glory space of heaven. And now, if those who are more sophisticated, this is the way to answer Kant and Barth and Thomas.
Yeah. I think maybe what could be helpful, and I don't know if you developed this or I'm sure you've definitely thought about this, but just for people that may be struggling to grasp all these concepts, right? Would it be helpful, Lane? Do you think it would be helpful to draw the analogy between regeneration and what happens to us through regeneration and the process of salvation and what's going to happen to, like you said, the earth as it's heavenized, right?
I see what you're asking. Yeah.
The analogy, in other words, between the cosmic versus the individual, the cosmic eschatology, the individual eschatology.
Let me try to put it this way. This might be useful. I'm not sure. And when I say these things, I think people know me well enough by now. I'm only trying to give clarity when I draw distinctions. I don't have my agenda. My agenda is to be clear and to try to be a faithful Reformed theologian, et cetera. So that's the agenda. But there are heavenizing. The way I'm going to present it in the book is a third option when it comes to what I consider to be more or less traditional views of how the earth relates to heaven post-consummation. 2 examples. The Lutheran view, as I understand it, and I want to be very, open to discussion, but Danny Olinger in his book on Vos and numbers of others have noted, is that the Lutheran view, whether this is the fairest way to put it or not, has been labeled as an annihilationist view, where the world is the earth is destroyed and annihilated, and so ceases to be altogether. There's secondly, on a different side of that, there is a kind of a neo-Calvinist transformational view that says, well, what happens to the world? If you want to know what the new earth, let me frame it this way. 2 Peter 3:13, the earth gets destroyed. There's a new heavens and a new earth. What is the status of that new earth? Well, I think you could say there are some who say it's totally annihilated, and something qualitatively new is simply replacing it. So it's displaced and replaced. We'll put it that way. So the displacement, replacement view, totally annihilated. Then on the transformational side, 2 Peter 3:13, the earth is restored to its original creational goodness. And so it's no longer marred by sin. The curse has been lifted. Genesis 3:17 and Romans 8:20, the subjection of the world to futility and curse, that's lifted. That's what the world is delivered from in the groanings in Romans 8:22 through 24. Now, heavenizing, here's what people are going to have to understand, and I may, by the time this book is published, it may be called something else. The editors may say, we don't like heavenizing, but I think this heavenizing is what it is. So I don't know what else to call it. There's always probably better language.
Amen.
But here's what heavenizing is. Heavenizing is not annihilation. Heavenizing is not restoration. Heavenizing of the earth is a spiritual act, the work of the Spirit. Listen, dimensionally translating Adam in Eden into heaven and reproportioning and conforming Adam and his environment to heaven. So it's this full-orbed dimensional translation that conforms what is on earth to heaven. So when Satan fell, for instance, in the Consummation, you can think of it this way. Just before the fall of Adam, on the hypothetical Adam obeys, what would have happened? Well, when the upper register was heavenized, or when the lower register is heavenized and dimensionally translated to fill the space of heaven and perfectly conform to it for the worship of God, when that happens, Adam and all the righteous on the earth, however long it's been, that's not a debate I'm interested in, to be honest with you, but however long it takes, at the absolute time point of consummation, Adam and the earth would be dimensionally translated and reproportioned perfectly to conform to the holy space in heaven. Now, what would happen to Satan and all who follow him? Satan, and this is a huge insight from Kline. I think this is, and I bring this point up in my review of Kline. Kline will make explicit that Satan and the host of Satan, in light of texts such as Isaiah 14:13 through 14 and Revelation 16, Satan and his followers will be pushed not only from heaven to earth, like when Satan fell, but from earth into the abyss or hell, which is itself a kind of created void, lacking structure and order, and it is the place of the weeping and the gnashing of teeth, the eternal smoke that rises in torment, and so on. And so, in the consummation, what happens is at the time point of consummation, the earth and all the righteous on it are dimensionally translated into and conformed to the holy space of heaven for that indirect worship of God to become direct. And Satan and those who follow him are dimensionally deproportioned, decreated into the abyss, where they continue to exist in all of their, we'll call it, deformed hatred of God.
Yeah, and their decreation.
One another.
Yeah, and their decreation is not a annihilation.
Right. It's a
confusion.
It's not.
It's a tohu bavohu. It's a back to a state of decreation, basically.
It's you could think of it as a return now, a post consummation return to the abyss, which in terms of Genesis 1:2 is that created space, or a space that is created and consigned to house those who are finally and climactically unconformed to heaven. That's the best way to think of it. There's a final and climactic unconforming to heaven, while creatureliness remains, but all of the glory and life and fellowship and vibrancy and comfort and bliss, all beatitude. The possibility of beatitude is forever gone, and the very converse, or how about we put it this way, the very opposite of beatitude marks the existence of those who are placed in the pit. But I do want to I'm not trying to plug this for Kline.
No, please do. Yeah.
But in his essential writings, I may have called them basic writings, but it's his essential writings. He has two essays, and one in chapter 2 and one that ends it, relative inclusios. And his work, I just appreciated again his work on the history of heaven. It's the idea that Vos is the one who makes us begin with the historical, and the historical is God's relation to heaven first as priority. But Kline's development of this, brother, it's really quite breathtaking.
In his essential writings, what you said in which chapters?
Chapter 2, and then the final chapter.
Oh, on Armageddon, the end of the millennium.
Yes,
chapter.
Armageddon. Oh yeah, which that one is
right.
You know, you always have the debate: what's the most penetrating that Kline ever did?
Right.
Well, that might be akin to asking, what. It's, in a manner similar to Vos or Gaffin or Rarebos, what was the best home run Babe Ruth ever really landed? But it's tough. It's truly it's tough. But what I highlighted in my review, which is I think only 2 pages, is that Kline's theology, in large part, is an attempt to sketch as clearly as possible from the scriptures the foundational role that the invisible heaven plays in the origin and destiny of the lower register itself.
Well, Lane, maybe we can just switch gears here just a little bit, if you still have a little time, because
I do.
Brother, there's a lot of different approaches to biblical theology, and there's a lot of material out there. I mean, biblical theology just exploded, and a lot of good stuff. Obviously, Goldsworthy, Beale, Clowney, Gradonus, a lot of stuff you can learn from a lot of guys out there. But
you should read it all.
Yeah, read it all. I have it all. I'm trying to read it all, but this particular brand of biblical theology that we're talking about, Vossian, Kleinian, I don't see anything else out there that quite captures the essence of the Adamic, let's say Adam 1, Adam 2 superstructure of biblical theology. I mean, these other authors, they might focus on the kingdom. They might focus on the temple. They might focus on the new creation. But there's just, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I'm finding out, there's just something much more, I guess the word would have to be therefore covenantal about Kline and Vos. As we think about the consummating the history of heaven, the issue of covenant, can you speak to that?
Yeah, there are various ways that you can speak of the covenant. I'll put it this way. Now, this is me reflecting on Kline and Vos after writing kind of some of the most of the main substance of this book, History of Heaven. But I think if I were to try to find what unites Kline and Vos most structurally, most basically, and this is a term I've been developing, and it's in the book. We'll see how. I just want to communicate. I'm not trying to be clever, but the term I use is that Vos and Kline unite on the servant relation of the lower register to the upper register. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is so profound for both Vos and Kline, and I'm not excluding others. We're just focusing on them because it's a book on the history of heaven indebted to them, and also to Gaffin quite a bit. I note Gaffin in the work on Paul. But the point is that when we're thinking about the history of heaven, it becomes for Vos and Kline it's the place of worship. I'm just trying to be plain. I just want to be plain.
Yeah.
The invisible heavens, created in the absolute beginning as a distinct spatial realm, to be distinguished from the spatial and temporal realm of the lower register, it is a place of worship. The glory of God is set on display to be worshipped, adored, enjoyed, glorified forever. Now, that means then that for both Vos and Kline, and this is part of their contribution, it's not that the Reformed have never said it before, because the Reformed have said it, but it has not been said in the light that is shed by the history of heaven, that covenant is a servant of worship. You see, the lower register serves the upper register where you worship. So what is covenant? Covenant is a servant of that worship in heaven. Adam is to enter the worship in heaven and be exalted above the angels. Hebrews 2:5-9. How? By perfect, personal, exact, and entire obedience to the covenant. So the whole logic of covenant is that covenant is a servant of worship. And covenant occurring in the lower register means that the lower register is covenantally a servant to the upper. And so from the outset, the way to, I'm going to put it one last way, the way that the earth and Eden intensively copies heaven in creation with two distinct registers, the consummative relation is that all that is holy on that earth is going to be dimensionally reproportioned into the fullness of heaven at the end of the age in consummation, where earth is permanently conformed to the glory dimension of heaven and worships the glory of God present immediately in that place. So that I really do think, Emilio, I'd have to go back. I'm looking at Kline, and I think what I'm saying is a bit of a modification of where he goes at the end of the day, but I think it's extremely similar, isn't it? In your estimate?
I absolutely think so. I mean, he has a whole section dealing with continuity, discontinuity of what's going to happen in the new heavens and in the new earth, and certainly everything is absolutely going to culminate in indoxation. That is everything, and so I think that's absolutely right. And I wish we could just do a whole thing just on Armageddon, because he develops all his thoughts there, and we'll have to do another show just focusing more intensively on those kinds of subjects. But go ahead, you were saying.
Oh, no. Let's do that, by the way, is what I was saying. But also, I've got to say this. I might be wrong. I may change this assessment, and so I always want to say if it's tentative. But I think I could be convinced. I'm not sure, but I think Kline's last work, God, Heaven, and Armageddon, was possibly his best, Emilio.
It's it's tough to beat, brother.
Amazing, quite amazing.
I'm currently on chapter 6, and it is so tremendous. And Lane, maybe just a little time here for a quick question for you. As we think about Kline and Vos, a lot of Armageddon, surprisingly, is really focused on Antichrist and a heavy doctrine of Antichrist. And I don't want to sidestep everything we just talked about and introduce a whole nother subject, but it's amazing because in between the consummation of the history of heaven, one thing that Kline in his writings makes really clear, and I don't know, you know more than I do here at this point, no doubt, but with Vos, Kline very much so focuses on the conflict in between. He calls it the eruption of Armageddon, the Armageddon conflict, and things like that.
Yes.
How does Vos speak to that at all? Is it in the Pauline eschatology? I mean, where does Vos have essentially the same Antichrist doctrine as Kline does, or what?
There is the place to go for Vos on that. He's got a section in the Pauline eschatology, page 94 to 136. 72 to 136, where the coming of the Lord and its precursors, the man of sin. Here's where I believe both Vos and Kline would wind up coming together on this. And I've got to be careful here because I'm going to describe my own view and say that they're reconciled in light of it somehow. But I think it's very safe to say this, that for both, if you ask what unites them, both of them would say that the religious destiny of man as the image of God from Genesis 1:1 forward is heaven. Not a renewed earth. Heaven, not with the earth being annihilated. But I think, and I want to say, I think this is the direction that both are moving. They're both moving more toward the direction of a thoroughgoing conforming of all things created on earth to the glory of the heaven temple and worship of God. In other words, everything in the lower register subserves the worship of God in heaven, and the heavenizing act, bringing that lower register as it is into the glory dimension of heaven for direct worship. That is I think its conclusion, where it ends, is precisely where I think Kline and Vos would end. The worship of God in heaven. And the new heavens and new earth, but would be, there would be probably some room for discussion on exactly how they think of the earth in relation to heaven, but the centrality of that heaven space as the space of worship. How we get to that space is one thing, but that it exists and it is the realm of worship where the ascended Christ is. That's I think the focusing union of the two. Which means both of them. And I'll say this, brother, I'll try to be as practical as I can be here. This puts us on a collision course with a lot of broader discussions in pluralist and evangelicalism and in contemporary Roman Catholicism, where following Schleiermacher, there is such a trend these days on religion being defined by the help of fellow man. In other words, now I'm channeling a Strimple here, but Strimple used to say, when Hans Kung asked Karl Rahner, what is the essence of salvation, and would you mind being called an honorary Buddhist if that were appropriate? He said, well, I don't mind being called that at all. Why? Because salvation, to really know God, is to know him in terms of unthematized worship and dependence. This is Karl Rahner's phrase, unthematized. All the second-order doctrinal language is like a dispensable shell, but this worship of God is just some natural thing where you measure the worship of God by the promotion of your worship of man, by the promotion of the worship of man, so that as long as you're promoting the good of your neighbor, and not being doctrinal or dogmatic, you're good. Vos and Kline put us on a collision course with that kind of worship, because for both Vos and Kline, the worship of God is regulated by his word. In other words, they're going to apply the regulative principle to the worship of God. It's not unthematized. It's strictly thematized. Or if Rahner says it's unthematized religious experience, we say no, it's covenantally thematized worship. So anyway, my point being, it is very important to remember that when we're talking about the worship of God, we have to say that the worship expresses two things always together. It expresses a religious disposition, and it expresses a theological conception or a revelation, a revealed dogmatic category. And, pardon me, no virus or anything. And the proper worship of God is the worshiping of the whole soul in devotion and obedience and fellowship, conforming to his word, but it's a conforming to his word. It's not simply autonomous, unthematic religious feeling. It's the expression of the whole soul in worship of God according to the concrete terms of his covenant. And that right there is a huge Vos-Kline connection. Oh, yeah. Kline is the most relentless theologian in the 20th century in insisting on ex pacto merit. He knows that Adam is a claimless creature of the dust who cannot merit anything naturally. But he also insists that Adam's reward is to be calculated according to a covenantal algorithm. Right? Yeah. There's no way around that. There's nothing abstract. Yeah. Adam's personal obedience to God is to be assessed and defined in terms revealed by the covenant. And Vos is, of course, groundbreaking, I think. Or how can I put this? I wouldn't want to say groundbreaking, ground deepening in amazing ways. And I think Kline continues that trend in this regard. The two of them, I'll put it this way. I think that, and I want to broaden it. I think that their work, along with the work of Ritterboss, and then especially with the work of Gaffin, just shows the constructive depth of insight in the Reformed biblical theological movement. We've got a Vos group talks about it. You've got this group that's talking about Kline, and you can talk for one book about one book. If you're doing it once a month, I think we've been doing it for 6 years. That's the depth of what we're talking about.
Yeah,
here.
That's encouraging, Lane. That's encouraging because when you're going through this material, it's encouraging to know that I'm not crazy, first of all, that it is that deep, that it does take that much time, that you can go. And I feel rushed half the time. The class will tell you. I mean, we do a 2-hour class every 3 weeks. And if every single week we run out of time, and we don't run out of material, because it's that profound.
Well, let me tell you, as I continue teaching, I say more each time I teach, and it takes me longer to get through it because it's so beautiful. I feel about biblical theology in a way similar to the way I feel about a good listen through to Bruckner's Ninth, and in 3 movements. You don't. I don't know anyone who likes Bruckner or Bruckner's Ninth or classical music who tries to put it on double speed so it can play more quickly.
Yeah.
No. The beauty of it.
It's a great metaphor. I'm gonna steal that.
Oh, sure. But the beauty of it is that you want to catch the intricacies of each organic and progressive movement in the music, right? And you want to savor that and enjoy it. There's something aesthetically pleasing. You don't want to speed it up.
Yeah.
It loses its aesthetic appeal. Well, similarly, see, when we study something that's historical, when we're using our biblical theological method, we need to capture, and I think Eric Watkins has a doctoral D-Min dissertation, dissertation, a book. All 3, I'm not sure. I know he's got a book that comes from some doctoral work he did on drama and preaching. And I think the reason why there's a concern to develop the drama dimension is that there's a rediscovery of biblical theology and an appreciation for the drama of history. And what I'm trying to do in this volume, and what I'm really not doing anything original. It's the same thing Vos and Kline and Gaffin and Ritterboss done. Just try. No, it is.
But still, it adds value, because if anything notorious about men like Kline, like Vos, like Van Til, is that they are notoriously hard to understand for most people. For everybody to some degree, and they need interpreters.
Well, I'm trying. I'll tell you what I'm working on in this book. I'm an English major and studied philosophy with Bahnsen for the master's and stuff. I never took it, but so English and philosophy are kind of what I worked on before going to seminary. And I because I've read so much of the Germans and the Dutch, I can almost tend to start writing like them. But in other words, I could write like a Faulkner naturally if I don't watch it. I'm trying to be disciplined and write like a Hemingway to be a little more crisp and clear, or to vary it. I'm trying to communicate the content of Vos and Kline, trying to channel something of the clarity of Machen.
Right.
But goodness,
it's tough.
That's my ideal. And right now the manuscript is uneven. There are portions where it reads like a syntactically constructed German sentence. It's terrible. It really does. It really does.
I know exactly what you mean.
Because I did the German exam at the seminary and worked on German when I was in college because I was interested in Kant and Hegel and everything. And so you do too much reading like that, it really truly can change the way you write. So I'm trying to be clear, and I hope it'll be useful. But to get to the point, the history of heaven. It really is, Emilio, when it's properly defined in terms of indoxation and Sabbath rest. If those are the 2 pivotal events that constitute in the Old Testament, then you know what that explains? That explains precisely why in Acts 1:11 Jesus Christ bodily ascended and then was translated out of this space-time dimension, this created visible realm, and translated bodily into heaven. If you want to know the clearest proof of what I'm trying to argue for, it's that Jesus, by the work of the Spirit, was the eschatological potential of his humanity was dimensionally reproportioned in ascension into heaven, where he now sits at the right hand of God. So that the space that Jesus occupied on earth, that bodily space, has been exhaustively, dimensionally translated, eschatologically reproportioned to heaven at the right hand of God. And as goes the first fruits, I know I'm applying this to ascension. 1 Corinthians 15:20 is resurrection, but I'm applying it to ascension. But as he is the ascended one in first fruits, so go those who are the harvest. And so his bodily dimensional translation into heaven, space translated into space, dimension into dimension, that dimensional transition is precisely what I just want to say this broadly, and people can think about this. And this is a little deep, but I want to say it because it'll help some people.
Yes.
But for Rome, remember, there is no being reproportioned to the glory dimension of heaven. There is being reproportioned to the essence of God. So rather than being dimensionally reproportioned as a creature whose eschatological potency has been realized in heaven, that's the deeper Protestant conception. Rome says no. Your humanity, the humanity of the image, is transcended when the supernatural likeness, right, of the donum is infused. When it reaches its full fruition, you are made a participant in the interiority of the processions as your intellect sees directly into the essence of God. See, so it's ontological reproportioning for Rome. For Barth, there's no direct access to God ever. See, for the deeper Protestant.
Can you explain at least just very briefly, but just
I can explain it.
Just for Barth in terms of Geschichte and what he is talking about there.
The best way I know how to put it is that for Barth, God has actualized himself as Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God, from all eternity. And in that event of incarnation, God wills himself to participate in a third time, which is called God's time for us. So there's God's time of endless days. There's Adam's fallen time in opposition to God. So when Adam is created, he's created and enveloped and encased in fallen time. Barth is explicit on this. I've got the quotes from this in my manuscript. But Barth is explicit that the first man was immediately the first sinner, and there was no golden age in Eden. When Adam was created, to the extent that Barth wants his feet on the ground in the lower register, he was a sinner already. And so Adam's time, and what that means,
that's worse. That's worse than concupiscence.
Yes. Well, what? Listen. Here's a lesson. Barth is the radicalizer.
Oh, there we go. We can see you better now.
Oh, sorry, brother. I'm sorry.
You're good.
Barth,
You're good.
Sorry,
You're
you
good.
should have told me to scoot up, brother.
No, that's okay.
I was
We
sitting
can
back. Barth radicalizes concupiscence. Concupiscence is a propension to sin, but not sin.
Right.
For Barth, Adam is created in history, let's just say in the lower register, he's created a sinner instantly. Wow. But in a primordial event that constitutes the divine life, God willed a third time, and that third time is God saying yes to humanity in Jesus Christ, so that God becomes eternally temporal and man becomes temporally eternal in the event of Jesus Christ. And in that event, there is exhaustive, absolute fellowship and identity. God and man are brought into a dynamic event of mutual dependence, and they enter into a process of becoming reconciled together ontologically in Jesus Christ, a third time that integrates the two, right? Integrates them in a redemptive and gracious event of election. Now, here's the problem. Only Jesus Christ has direct access to God. And for Barth, those who remain in history and who will remain there forever only have indirect access to God. So on Barth's view, there is no direct access to God. There's Geschichte and there's history. And the fundamental problem with Barth is that there's no natural religious fellowship with God, and there's no reconciling of the two dimensions of fallen time and God's time for us. They remain separate and parallel realms, related by a dialectic, but they remain separate ultimately. There is no reconciliation of Adam's fallen time and God's time for us. There's simply God's time for us in a time dimension wholly beyond us. And we acknowledge that dimension, but we don't ever directly see and worship the glory of God. So Barth's view of heaven, here's a way to put it. If you look over at Rome and you say, hey, where's heaven? They say, well, it's inside. It's called the essence of God. Just got to get inside the essence, go in that house, and that's your beatitude. Okay, so that's ontological participation. There is no house, there's the essence of God. For Barth would tell you, yeah, there is a house, but it's closed. It's closed to you forever because you have no natural capacity to receive it, no natural desire to apprehend it, no natural to have faith. And so in the analogy of faith, Jesus Christ believes for you. And when you agree with Jesus Christ, there is an analogy between the faith he has and your agreement and faith in him. And in that event, you are ineffably reconciled to God in the event of the revelation of Jesus Christ. And here's what it leaves everyone doing. People who don't know theology or philosophy are looking like this. But those who do simply recognize this, that for Barth, the registers are separate.
They're separate and they're closed. And the one is closed.
And so you go to Barth's house, and if you're going to Barth's house, the upper register for Barth, it's got a closed forever sign on it. And how does the closed sign is primordial.
And so and how would that, probably going back to more of the Roman concept, but how would that relate to the Eastern Orthodox concept, to the Orthodox view?
It seems to me, now I'm just going to say this broadly because I have become aware through reading works that there's some pluriformity in that tradition that I need to account for. But I think one of the great concerns of the Eastern Orthodox view is what specifically and conceptually are the energies by which God relates to the world. And it's a very it's a problematic concern. And let me just say this without getting into the details of what I think might plague Eastern Orthodoxy, and I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, and I don't know if off the top of my head I could do a fine job detailing someone like a Lasky or a Zazoulis or something like that. But let me just say this. I think when the Eastern Orthodox speak of participating in the energies of God, but in a way that seems to be distinguished from the essence of God, it's hard for me to see them maintaining a robust doctrine of simplicity, and because of that, I see it unlikely that they're going to it's hard for them to maintain a robust doctrine of simplicity, and their doctrine of participation bears some, but not all, of the sorts of problems you find with Rome.
Okay, that's really good. So, Lane, maybe bring us home here and tell us, I don't know if you want to speak to this because, of your book and what you're writing, you want to give away too much here, but
I don't care.
But just specifically, bringing the history of heaven to a close through Jesus Christ in simplest terms.
Yeah, the simplest way I know how to put it is that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15,
because that's what you did. That's what you did in your Wimberley lectures, I remember, and that progression was exactly that's exactly what we needed to hear. So it was really good.
Well, a couple of ways to get at it, but when Jesus, I'll put it in terms of Lucan and then Hebrews theology.
Sure.
But in terms of Luke's theology, Jesus descends to the earth to destroy the devil and his followers. And the history of heaven, this is an interesting, sometimes these things are so obvious that when you point them out, people say, that's really obvious. And I don't want to say things that are too obvious, but I will say this. Satan fell from the heaven temple into Eden, I think, in a time roughly coincident with the Spirit descending to create. In other words, 1 John 3:9 and Romans 8:24, Satan fell from the very beginning. He's been a murderer and a liar and a sinner from the beginning. So no sooner did he see the glory of God than he despised it, and that's one of the greatest mysteries in the Scriptures. How could that happen? But because what Adam was supposed to do is sanctify Eden like heaven is sanctified for the worship of God, and Satan wanted to corrupt heaven first and then earth. And so when Satan sifted Adam like wheat, the whole logic of Jesus coming as the second and last Adam is the redemptive completion of the creational and covenantal project that Adam failed to attain. And so when Jesus comes, his entire earthly ministry is a ministry that is marked by suffering, the desert temptations of Jesus in Luke 4, that ultimately give way to an entire life of suffering that consummates on the cross. And the point at Wimberley, I think I'll stay on this because if we go to Hebrews, it'll get too long. Sure. But the point I made at Wimberley is that the fruition of Jesus' death as the last Adam is paradise. He in 3 days from his resurrection, that the time point of his death, his reasonable soul will depart to be in heaven with the thief. His body will be laid in the ground, and 3 days later, when he is raised from the dead, he will be raised body and soul, and he will enter into the paradise of God. And the thief asks if Christ will remember him, and when Christ says, "Today you will be with me in heaven," he is speaking about the translation of the thief's soul to the intermediate state and promising him that his body, still united to Christ, will be raised at the end of the age when he comes in his kingdom in great glory and power. And so I just realized I was sitting back again. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine.
But you know, that whole notion of Jesus' temptations, wilderness, I'm talking Luke 4, wilderness, mountain, temple, that's the movement of a new exodus. You traverse the wilderness, come to Mount Sinai, receive plans for the tabernacle, worship God in the land. That's the exodus is to be brought out of Egypt to behold the glory of God descending in the tabernacle and worship that glory and be satisfied in God. That's it. And when that happens, in terms of the old covenant worship, or when that happens in terms of the new covenant worship, that's what everything is ultimately about. And so, so anyway, I think as we just kind of round out here in terms of these contributions, I think that what Vos and Kline gave us, and Ritterboss develops this. Gaffin does Ritterboss does amazing work on this in Paul and Coming of the Kingdom, and a number of other works. Gaffin does astonishing work in Perspectives on Pentecost, Resurrection, Redemption. But there really is, I think, something. If I were to say this, I think that Kline thinks more like an architect and an artist, and is concerned about the architectural features of heaven and its history, and that might be his unique and intense contribution at the end of the day. The history of heaven becomes a totalizing history that envelops conditions and determines the character and the meaning of the history of earth and the covenant.
Well, amen. Well, brother, that was so helpful and very, very rich. You'll have to come back because I really would like to, if you agree to it, spend some quality time maybe focusing on Harmageddon and Kline, as you said, is probably his best book. And
Surely
I
one
don't
of
know,
them.
man. I'm right there with you, but maybe next time you join us, we'll pick a chapter, a subject, or a topic, or something where we can dive a little deeper into something that
Emilio,
would be
I would love
helpful.
that. That sounds great to me, brother. I had
Yeah.
a delightful time with you. It feels like it lasted
Yes.
5 minutes.
Oh yeah, for sure. And so when do you expect the book to come out, Lane? And what's it called again?
Called The History of Heaven. That my subtitle's The Deeper Protestant Conception because I want it there, but I don't know. It's going to be with Reformed Forum, and I'm not good with titles or chapter headings or anything. So I think they're going to stay with it. I think History of Heaven will stay. If there's a subtitle, great. If not, I don't care. Uh,
Okay.
but it might be something like Indoctrination, Sabbath Rest, and the Ascension of Christ, something like that.
Great. I love it. That sounds
But
good to me,
yeah,
brother.
but that would that might be what I'm after. But listen, I'm going to try to finish it in the next week. I think I'm
Awesome.
close. I thought I'd finish it this week, but I haven't yet. I think I'm going to go see my family. I was going to write some more, but it's time to go see them. But brother,
Yeah,
blessings.
good.
Thank you so much. Keep up
Yeah,
the wonderful
absolutely.
work, and keep me posted how this does. I hope we're a good service to people.
Oh, for sure, for sure. All right. Well, Lane, thanks so much, brother. God bless
Uh,
you, and
Delightful, brother.
we'll
Thanks.
we'll be in touch.
Okay, talk to you soon. Keep it
Yep.
up. Be safe.
Yeah, you
All
too,
right, brother.
brother. God bless you. Thank you. Well, there you have it, guys. Lane Tipton on the program, and now you see why I brought him on, because this biblical theology and just the depth and the richness of it is something that we want to start really plowing through here on Red Grace Media, and just to let you know what's coming up ahead. We want to eventually resume our conversation regarding presuppositional apologetics out of First Corinthians. But we have so many other different projects and whatnot. So be sure, if you want more about this stuff, obviously you want to catch Lane Tipton on the Reform Forum. Start going through the Vos group. As he said, they've been doing it for 6 years, and that is a wealth of biblical theological information there. And I mean, it's there's really nothing else quite like it. Also, on our YouTube channel, you can start following us on the Kline group, as we're trying to actually go through God, Heaven, and Harmageddon, which is a really great, challenging, wonderful, rich time. And so I just pray that you'll join us and that you'll stay tuned. If you like the program today, make sure you subscribe, share, leave your comments and questions in the section below on YouTube, and be sure to tune in next time for the next edition of Red Grace Media. And today was obviously Reformed theology. We've done a lot of Reformed apologetics, but at any rate, God bless you. Great to see you. I pray that you do stay safe. Pray that you and your family will be well during this time. And I pray that God has mercy on us and that we can resume fellowshipping at churches and congregating again, as it seems like this thing has caused all churches to stop congregating everywhere now. So we just pray that you'll be okay. God bless you. Great to see all of you. And till next time, God bless you.